Hello, everyone. I'm excited to welcome you to the Diversity and Inclusion of Healthcare AI panel. Let me briefly introduce our amazing panelists. Today we have Alpan Patel, who is a medical director for AI at Geisinger and Still Institute for Health Innovation. Chris Hamphill, Applied AI and Growth Vice President at Actium Health. Michael Lean, co-founder of SPACT, and Agechi Nwoke, head of business development at Atman Health. And our moderator is Terry Kramer, who has extensive technology and leadership experience. He's a former Vodafone Group executive and US ambassador. Currently, he is a faculty director of the Eastern Technology Management Center at UCLA Anderson and one of the most loved Anderson professors. With that said, I will pass it to the professor to kick off the discussion.
Excellent. Hey, Natalia, a big thank you. And I've been looking forward to this. The whole idea about the intersection of technology and healthcare, and specifically in this panel, really kind of thinking about how do we ensure inclusion when we look at our AI systems. So I can't think of a more timely topic and a more relevant topic that really, I think, makes for a great discussion. I want to thank ahead of time all of our panelists and the organizers for this. Now, what I'm hoping to do is just first starting out with each of the panelists, getting a view about what the opportunity is, what the vision is in their own kind of organization. And then I want to understand a little bit better about what are the risks and the concerns, what can go wrong with the use of AI in healthcare, and then get into a discussion. Then what do you do? What are some of the best practices that are out there? How do those get implemented well? How do we think about what are some of the risks of the implementation efforts, et cetera? So I hope to go through all of that. And then at the very end, I'll try and share some of my own learnings. We'll have several minutes at the end also to do audience Q&A. So let me just start out, and again, a welcome to all of our panelists here, and just start out and just get a better sense from each of you about your organization, its focus, and what does the vision look like? What is the opportunity for the use of data and AI that fundamentally can improve healthcare? Chris, do you want to start?
No pressure. No, I really appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion. And just to give a bit of background, because I know that we're going to have broad topics. AI is a very broad topic. And then to make that real and make it tangible, there, like with the audience here, I'm sure there's different specific lanes that we can focus on. So I want to preface that by saying that a lot of where I'm going to be coming from is like kind of framed by my background at Actium Health, which is a company that's focused on outreach for patients who might need particular services. So when using the information that's available within a health system or a hospital context, especially when we're talking about EMR data, which is a reflection of who was able to come in for services and who was treated for services, there's all kinds of biases that first of all exist at the economic level, at the system level, and even at the business process level. And those biases then get reflected in the data that healthcare marketers and people in healthcare outreach interact with, as well as people like myself in data science. I wanted to first emphasize the population health and marketing and outreach aspect before the data science aspect, because the more I think about responsible AI, the more that we approach these problems, it's not just a matter of correcting algorithms, like correcting the approach that artificial intelligence algorithms take. That's one part of the picture, but we're looking at the broad overall business context of like if outreach is being driven by like data-driven campaigns, it doesn't matter if you're using AI or not. You're still using a biased data set to determine what those outreach patterns should be. So I want to focus, my focus and interest comes from addressing the general, like looking at AI as a potential, a useful response to systemic issues that exist beyond the data. Without talking about, I know I'll have the opportunity to go too deeper into detail. I don't want to hog the mic too much, but just wanted to give that background of let's think about this broader business context and how AI might be able to help correct some of these issues if used correctly. But of course, if not used correctly, we're going to perpetuate and amplify the problem.
Excellent. Very helpful. And Michael, why don't we go to you? Tell us maybe a little bit about SPECT and specifically, again, the vision that you see about the use of AI and data in healthcare.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for having us and letting us speak about this. So here at SPECT, we are a data science company that is operating in the eye care space. We really see ourselves as a 23andMe of retinal images. So that the retina, that's the back part of your eye, which is very predictive for eye health, but also for cardiovascular and neurological diseases such as stroke, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and heart attack. So what we've built is what we call the stethoscope for the eye. It's this device right over my shoulder over here, which is an easy to use telemedicine platform that is intended to be used by all healthcare professionals. So for us, that means we want to empower nurses and medical assistants and paramedics to take optometry, ophthalmology grade images for diagnosis and enable really the specialists to focus on what they do best, and that is patient care and treatment. And so the long-term vision for us, for any Star Trek fans out there, is we really see this as the tricoder for, that would be used in primary care, where you can bring the device up to the eye, take a scan, and then be like, hey, you're at risk for X, Y, and Z diseases that we'd be able to see and diagnose based on that retinal image.
Excellent. I'm a Trekkie, so I'm going to probably follow up with more applications of Star Trek. Great. Hey, Ogechi, how about you? Same question there on the organization and the vision and opportunity.
Thank you. So I lead business development at Atman Health, and we are a company that uses AI-driven software to sort of address the cost and quality issues that are plaguing care delivery. And so it's really sort of a balance of controlling the subjective nature of medicine. And also sort of amplifying some of the more objective parts of care delivery. So we work to try to systematize sort of the way that we treat patients, and we make sure that it's data driven rather than the subjectivity that we see in our healthcare system. By you might see the same patient who presents with all the same stats on paper, but physician to physician, the way that patient ends up being treated can vary, and the results of that can vary as well. And we believe that every patient should sort of get that best result. And then on the other hand of that, the objective nature of medicine is some parts of how you deliver care is very, very guideline driven. And so a core of our solution is based in med titration and initiation, and being able to sort of take that off of the plate of the provider so that they can focus on some of the more subjective pieces of care and sort of change the cost curve on sort of this non-scalable workforce. We need a lot more primary care physicians than we currently have. And we're basically trying to put a software solution to sort of address that need. So.
Excellent. Very helpful. And then Alpen, how about you?
First of all, I thank you. I agree with everything that our panelists have said. Geisinger is a system that has a clinic enterprise as well as insurance enterprise that allows us to care patients that some of them are our own members. So we look at not only great patient care, but also look at the cost of care as well. And that's where we sort of come in as well. So our goal at Geisinger is to fundamentally redefine medicine and fundamentally change the way we care of patients. And AI will play a part of that solution. And we can talk about various examples as the panel goes on.
Excellent. So far what we have in terms of the opportunity here is this idea about improved costs, so lower cost, improved quality is a second area, dealing with a shortage of physicians that Ogechi had talked about, and then talking about kind of this reformation of healthcare as a broader opportunity. So we've kind of got a sense of what the opportunity is here. And a lot of these remind me of kind of that adage about technology, if it runs well, being cheaper, better, faster. So that's kind of the positive. Now let's understand, where are the risks in all of this? And Chris, you were starting to get into some of the risks here and biased data sets elsewhere. Say a little bit more. What can go wrong here, and what are the areas of greatest concern?
So given hopefully everybody gets a chance, so I want to answer from kind of that healthcare outreach perspective, which is, let's say that that an organization wants to run communication and make sure they're establishing relationships with people who need cardiology services or likely to need those services. Well, if given that these data sets that they're operating from reflect the biases in the economies and business processes that they're presented with, well, by creating algorithms and by creating approaches or creating artificial intelligence or machine learning approaches as well, by using that biased data set without putting appropriate checks, you have the possibility of projecting that bias. Mm-hmm. And a way to get into an example of this is, let's say that the surrounding areas, like a hospital service area, has a distribution of, let's say, 50% white consumers, 25% Black, some other percent of other races. But because of the economics and cultural difference in play, the data set is heavily skewed. In this example, heavily skewed to where it's 75% white population that they're dealing with. Well, without the appropriate checks and balances, you might build a model, make an approach, and it might even show up like the results might even show an extremely high degree of accuracy. But then when you start breaking down, when you start looking at the nuances of, well, what's the accuracy or performance metrics among our Black patients or our Asian patients, et cetera, and you start seeing where those distributions break down and where those levels of performance are not as well. What's the cost of that in terms of outreach? Well, if people aren't being communicated about programs that they need, or if they're not being targeted for enrollment in programs that the health system has available for patients that have those needs around those heart health services, then that's missed opportunity for people who need care to receive it. So when you start looking at these algorithms and you start looking at these approaches and looking at ways that you might be able to expand, what's really at stake here is that for along racial lines or along cultural lines, people can potentially miss out on life-saving or life-assisting communications and programs that the health system has available for them.
Yep. One quick follow-up question on that. It's always interesting to say, what is the root cause of that? So how would a biased data set occur? Is it because the people that are designing the offering don't care? Is it because they're thinking about the wrong market? How does that happen? Because I assume the solution has to kind of get at what was the root cause of the issue.
So yeah, and that opens it up to be a hard problem, right? Because when you look at the root cause of the issue, the factors that I tend to look at are like what we'll look at a data set and we'll see the distribution and we'll compare it to the overall population outside of it. But why would that data set be different? Why would the patients that have been seen have a different distribution than the surrounding community? A lot of times it's about the economics of the area. It's about how well minority populations can afford services or are likely to engage services versus other populations that might be wealthier. Also, there are cultural aspects that come into play where in some cultures, some examples, people are less likely to seek medical care, even though they might be showing symptoms or have needs. So the root cause, the sad part about the picture that I'm painting here is that if we want the data set to be unbiased, if we want that to be perfect, then it would depend on having an unbiased society. So we don't have time to wait for that. So a lot of the solution that we focus on is given that the data sets are going to be biased, how do we look at the model's output and make adjustments from the output. So the input, hopefully the input can change over time, but a lot of where we actually have where we have more control then becomes the kinds of metrics that you use to define what the algorithm's focused on, what kinds of labels you're using, whether or not you're using cost or a better representation of how sick someone is. So there's all kinds of choice. Like I paint a gloomy picture by talking about the overall economics and big things that unfortunately none of us on this call have control over. But there are a lot of aspects where we do have control and have the potential to reverse some of these biases that are that are showing up in our data sets.
Makes sense.
So, Chris,
I would assume that being aware of the root cause and the problem is the first step to solving it, notwithstanding the challenge of solving it. Michael, let me ask you, is the problems that Chris identified analogous at SPECT or a different set of risks and concerns?
Oh, absolutely. I think Chris has put it very well. We see the same problems. To his point, the first step is always about measuring and knowing what you're measuring, benchmarking, and that's how you know and identify the gaps in your data set. Once you do know where the gaps in your data set, then it's about the outreach and improving that input, as he put it, to make sure you have a representative population, a representative data set. We've seen this time and time again, right? It goes all the way back from when pharmaceutical companies were doing clinical trials predominantly on male population, even when there were drugs that were meant to be used for pregnancy and things like that. And, this has been a problem that's been going on for a long time of not using, not picking the right input sources to use to really get the studies to understand what we're looking for.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. And Alpin, let me go to you on this, in terms of the problems that you see, and let me put an added layer on this thing as I kind of think of technology companies broadly. Both Chris and Michael talk about having measures of success. And I kind of think of technology companies are highly iterative. And, the idea of like measures of success is what I would teach in my class. They might say is very kind of MBA and business school and strategy and all that. And let us just iterate and let's see what happens. Is this kind of part of a cultural change that needs to happen at technology companies to not just think about do the kind of normal iteration, but think about what you're trying to achieve? How do you know when you're off base on it? And then back into product design better. Your view on all of that?
Yeah, I think bias is something that has to be considered at every stage of model development, whether it's data prep, whether it's model itself, the math of it, and how people use the model as well, right? So just because you have bias doesn't mean that all is lost. It's what you do with that data that really matters. It's just to expand on what Chris was saying earlier. Let's say that you have a model that says that predicts very accurately who is going to not show up for their appointment. But you take that data and you can do one of two things. One is you can say, I'm going to overbook appointments so that if somebody doesn't show up, I can fill all those slots. So that's good for revenue, but not necessarily for equity, right? So we have to dive down into why those people are not showing up. The second option is call those folks, actively engage them, and say, why are you not showing up? In our area, some people may not have the money to come to us because they don't have the gas money, or maybe they can't afford to take time off to come to us. So how do we work with them to actually engage them and bring them in for those appointments? So not are they not. So here's bias, but we would be using it in a fashion that allows them to engage us and take better care of themselves. So that, and allow them to take better care of themselves, and therefore decreasing that inequity, right? So bias, yes. Fairness, improved potentially.
Okay, excellent. Okay, let me go to you on this to try and again, last level of kind of drilling down on causes, and then we're going to talk about where some of the fixes are. As you kind of listen to the comments made here, how many of these problems are insidious in nature that people just don't care? How much of it is kind of a cultural aspect in an organization? How much of it is organizational that everybody's assuming somebody else is solving the problem? But just kind of, if you were to analyze all these problems and the root causes, what kind of comes to mind here? Oh, can't hear you there.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself.
Yeah.
But I was going to say that I think it's sort of a combination, and making sure that we do sort of the best work with this technology comes from understanding where the constraints are. So AI isn't perfect. And a lot of the models today rely on deep learning, which is like multi-layered neural networks with a bunch of tunable parameters. And they can perform some tasks with intense accuracy, but once you've taken them out of that situation, the model becomes a bit unpredictable, and I think that we have to be aware of that, and we have to sort of do what we can to make sure that we are making training data that looks like the population that we're trying to serve. Mm-hmm. And I mean, and there's different practices that people try to put into place in order to do that, but it's going to be a constant check and balance. Did we make this correctly? And now, when you put it into play, how are we using it? What were the outcomes? And sort of really, once again, balancing sort of, you know, the objective and subjective nature of the thing that we're trying to do in the first place, I think.
Yeah. And is your view, this is the nature of how things have to work, is this trial and error, because you want the best of the AI. It may, if it works in its best, lower costs, improve access, et cetera, but you got to be thoughtful about, you know, where it doesn't apply. Or you say, no, you know, we're playing with fire here. That, you know, this is like an autonomous vehicle, letting it kind of roll out early stage, and a whole bunch of people are going to die because you really didn't have the data to power the vehicle effectively.
I mean, we are playing with fire a bit, but I think it's something that must be done for us to sort of evolve and move forward and really get to the places that we need to get in our healthcare system. And I think there's ways to do it safely, and there's ways to do it ethically. And when that, and unfortunately with healthcare, the consequences are very high. You know, if we're talking about Netflix and they suggest a movie to me that I don't like, you know, nobody dies. Mm-hmm. But with healthcare, we're talking about people ending up getting underdiagnosed, overdiagnosed, misdiagnosed, and the downstream consequences of that can be really, really big. So,
yeah. Good. Excellent. Michael, let me go to you now in terms of kind of where are the solutions? How do you balance it? Because I think the general sentiment is if you use data and AI well, you can get some really big improvements. If you foul up on it, and really bad fouling up on it, to Ageki's point, you're playing with fire here. Where do you see some solutions here that kind of strike the right balance?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, absolutely, yes, we are playing with fire, but I think the question is this half-finished solution, you know, better than this current status quo? And in a lot of cases, you know, the answer is yes. But more to that, it's also how do you build in the correct checks and balances, right? So for us, for example, because we're only a diagnostic solution, the patients do get referred to a specialist, and the specialist will have their own assessment there. And so even if we do overdiagnose or underdiagnose, there's still checks and balances to make sure, you know, that hopefully the patient won't die at the end. Mm-hmm. So to your earlier question of like, you know, testing and benchmarking, I mean, absolutely. You know, you need to continuously monitor and you know, make sure that you are improving, you know, on a day-to-day basis.
Excellent. So your point would be, if we go back to autonomous vehicles, and I know this is a healthcare panel, not transportation, but, you know, 40,000 people die a year in car accidents, and almost all of them are human-caused accidents. And so you're saying we got to be thoughtful here. If we're going to hold off autonomous vehicles that have the prospect of reducing accidents, we've created a separate problem. So we have to kind of look at that trade-off, is your point.
Right. It's always about opportunity cost, right? What are we giving up, or what are we, leaving on the table by not taking these solutions? They're not going to be perfect from day one, and that's a risk we need to accept. But it's with the intent that, like, we will make mistakes, but hopefully we're able to learn from those mistakes and make our systems more robust, so that it doesn't happen again.
Okay, good. Alpin, let me ask you here now to drill down on, what are the kind of safeguards, best practices, if you feel comfortable, best in class organizations that have actually managed these issues really well. And if you want to be provocative, worst companies that have been irresponsible in these areas, what would come to mind? Oh, you have you on mute there.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
So I think we have to be very careful about how we design and understand the problem. So first is going to be the definition of the problem. Second, when somebody comes to us and say, I want to do data science on this, I want this information, our first question is usually, what do you want to do with that data? If we give you a perfect set of data set and outcomes, what are you going to do with that? Do you have your teams engaged? What are the operational changes? What are the changes in clinical care that you're going to make with that data? Mm-hmm. What are the do you have your teams engaged to leverage some of those things? And if you don't, let's go back to the drawing board to do that. 95% of machine learning is not necessarily machine learning, right? It's not the cool stuff. It's a lot of the front end work that you have to do in order to execute the translation. So once that happens, you can design it so that there are less errors. Human in the loop. There is increasing evidence that machine alone or humans alone don't perform as well as both of them combined. So human in the loop is a potential solution to that as well. And I think Michael alluded to that. So number one is to understand the problem. Number two is to make sure that you have the workflow in place for integration of the problem. And in that workflow, you can mitigate some of these biases like the other panelists have discussed.
Okay. So basically, you've got to be thoughtful about what you're trying to achieve, what you want to do with data, human in the loop, all of that. Any examples that come to mind here of great companies, great organizations, or ones that really have not handled things well?
So I can machine learning is not necessarily easy, and we've learned a lot of things with it. Mm-hmm. So when we were developing our head bleed algorithm early on, so we learned when we first tested it, it turned out that one particular hospital always said that this patient had a head bleed, and when we actually traced it back, we realized that it was latching onto the headgear of the head CT and not necessarily onto the bleed. Mm-hmm. We had done a data-driven approach to it, and when we realized that, we also realized that our data was not balanced. We had, without meaning to, we pulled data from one particular hospital and called it positive, mm-hmm. Because all the positives came from the hospital. So the machine actually latched onto the headgear from that hospital and said that is what I'm looking for, and not necessarily the bleed. Mm-hmm. So data balance and data preparation is 95% of the work, right? So mm-hmm. we made an error in that way. And we fixed it. Once we balanced the data, then all of that went away. Mm-hmm. But that's why, as I said earlier, biases and have to be thought about from every stage of the game, from data preparation to model preparation to down to its use.
Yep. Excellent. Great. Chris, similar question to you. Solutions that you've seen that are impressive, best organizations that you've seen handle it, and worst ones.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to say the worst ones by name, but here's my approach to the problem. Because when working with a health system, you quickly realize that there are all kinds of different interests and different perspectives that are coming to play. And really exciting is when we started venturing down responsible AI, and I started saying, hey, your data are biased, and that's a reflection of biased business process and economics in your area. I didn't know if I was going to get fired or not. I didn't know that if they were going to say, hey, we don't want to be hearing that kind of stuff. So it was a big risk. And with most people that we had these conversations and presentations with and talked about the efforts that we'd be doing with responsible AI, with most people in healthcare organizations. Again, I walked into it not knowing what the outcome would be, whether or not they'd be receptive to it, but they were receptive to hearing hearing these conversations. And again, specifically in the hospital/health system space. So I'm not talking pharma or payer markets or things like that, specifically around hospitals. But it was really exciting to hear how a lot of folks who are working in health systems are mission driven and receptive to trying to understand how to balance out these efforts. So even in an organization where there was some opposition or indifference to some of the things that we were discussing, most of it's been the case in each system that I've spoken to that there's been a majority of interest. So it wasn't kind of at the system level, but more at an individual level. Mm-hmm. Now, I want to excitedly name a name here, though, which was I was on a panel that Duke recently put on with regards to, Duke Margolis Policy Center. They had a responsible AI in healthcare with a focus on policy interests. And I forget the name of the presenter, but she was from UCSF, and she pointed out, and this was really exciting, but she pointed out that the data science team that she was leading was responsible for evaluating algorithmic approaches that were being used by vendors. So one vendor that came into play was Epic, where I think Epic was pushing their sepsis algorithm. And their team actually was able to go in and evaluate the algorithm and respond that in their case, at their health system, there was an amount of bias being displayed that would force them to develop their own algorithm rather than rely on Epic's. So why that excites me is, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, you didn't have as much of a spotlight on responsible AI issues. You had a bunch of people who would say, well, people who have too much trust in spreadsheets, or they would say quotes like, the data doesn't lie. Mm-hmm. Even though we know that you can kind of make data say a lot of different things and manipulate it in all kinds of ways. So it showed an exciting level of sophistication to hear about organizations that are holding their vendors accountable, taking these things to task, and making sure, it's just exciting to hear about healthcare leaders who are willing to hold these things accountable and prevent things that might do harm from being used in the system. This is just there's no way for me to prove this, but it just feels like 10 years ago, before before AI was really broadly discussed as a realistic thing to be used. We didn't have that level of sophistication around the potential harm and challenges that it could cause.
Yeah, Chris, is it fair to say you're relatively optimistic about these issues getting solved? Because your point is generally you got to just raise the level of awareness, but most people in the broader ecosystem want to do the right thing, and that's half the battle. Is that fair to say?
It's fair to say, only if I'm surrounding myself with people who are interested in this issue, and I'm coming on these talks, I come away with a feeling of optimism. But then I'll type in responsible AI in Google Trends, and the line is flat. So I've been hearing the Gartner Group discuss more, and I think that there's more of a spotlight. But I can't be optimistic outside of the efforts of panels like this. If there's a level of energy and conversation that continues around this, then that could stoke optimism. But very like seeing those players inside organizations who are indifferent, and even looking at the amount of time that it takes for tech and data standards to keep up with certain various metrics, with things like sexual orientation and gender identity information, it's taking time. So I'll put myself at even keel, and I think optimism will be stoked if we have more conversations like these, and I hear more from healthcare leaders about questions around AI ethics. But I would say more even keeled than optimistic right now.
Excellent. Very makes sense. Makes sense. Okay, let me ask you same question on this again about the solutions you see. And so far, it's interesting. Most of the messages are about responsibilities of both the leaders and employees inside an organization, how they define what they're trying to achieve, how do they kind of check for problems along the way. It's fairly kind of process oriented inside an organization, as opposed to the people you have are the wrong people or the motivations are bad or whatever else. What is your view on all of that?
I mean, it's hard for me to point out specific organizations, but I definitely think that, I would probably say that I'm about even keel as well, similar to Chris, but
yeah,
I really like to believe that, people are well-intentioned. But sometimes that could actually be sometimes that can actually be the most dangerous spaces. And I think everyone thinks that they're doing the right thing and that they're thinking about all the different parameters. But the one fail-safe that you can sort of do to try to ensure that is to make sure you have a really diverse group of people around the table. So not just whatever their backgrounds are, but professionally, what do they believe in? What sticks out to them? Because a group of people who all kind of care about the same things are all going to have the same blind spots.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that becomes really dangerous when we're talking about people who are innovating in the artificial intelligence space.
Yeah, can you give us a couple of examples about kind of ideal diversity in an organization that is responsible for AI-based solutions in healthcare?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, if you're, say for example, a company that like mine that's trying to develop AI-driven software for care delivery and things, and this is something that has to be tested. You have to do pilots, and it's not going to just be great software that gets it done. So you can have people who are building great software that that's trying to be transparent, even with the parameters that they use to make the decisions that they're making, but then you use a convenient data set or something like of that nature. And that can be sort of like your Achilles heel. So it takes more than just good software engineers. You also need people with research expertise. And honestly, I would say people who are used to working with social determinants of health, people who are actually thinking about the problems that we're trying to prevent. And then you need to have the right operational staff around the table to help implement them in the right way as well. Because once again, you can have software that works perfectly, but if you deploy it in very specific scenarios, then it now becomes a bias situation where people are not getting they're not getting what they deserve out of the technology that you've developed. So.
Yep, makes sense. Makes sense. Good. Michael, let me go to you because we're drilling down more on specifics now about how to kind of get the right outcomes here. And we've been talking about the actors here. Who's responsible for all this? We've talked a lot about companies, the employees, et cetera. Most of what we've talked about, which to me, and Chris, I'm taking some of the optimism from what you're saying, is that we own this stuff as opposed to regulation. Because one of the questions that's come up from the audience is, what are the roles of regulation? Michael, am I going too far to say that, listen, if you want real solutions here, we got to own the problem ourselves. We have to self-police, we being organizations and businesses, as opposed to regulations here. Do you agree with that or no, that's too big a leap?
I think it really depends. I would agree on some piece of it. I think it needs to come from within. There is some, responsibility for the organizations and for the community to come together and set a standard, and we've seen this in other fields, right? For example, USB, IEEE, all of these standards are determined from the industry leaders rather than from regulation. But I do believe that regulation, the FDA does have a role to play in this also. But what we've seen, at least here in the US, is that regulations usually tend to be laggards into monitoring and putting out policy that makes sense. We're seeing it now already with tech, right? With big data, where where the regulation and the government seems to be 2 to 3 years behind where people are pushing on the border. So I think it's a combination of both. It's self-policing each other from a community perspective, but also having the government back that up with actually regulatory policies and guidances going forward.
Okay, and when you say regulation, you're talking a little more heavily about standards as opposed to kind of, you can and can't do this.
I think it really depends, right? The way that the government has typically interacted with us to date has been with standards, but I think that they are open to having these discussions and putting out guidances. I can think of one, case with the NIST. So the NIST runs a facial vision recognition test where, AI vendors doing facial recognition things can run and benchmark their systems against. So it's having that level of collaboration and standardized tests so that when one company presents their results and say, we're 95% or 97%, at least there's some trust and confidence that this number, I can compare it to another number from a different vendor because they've tested against the same standards.
Excellent. So could you give us an example at SPECT about kind of self-policing, how you can ensure there isn't bad outcomes, and actually where do you need standards and maybe even more specific regulations, not for SPECT doing something naughty, but another player in your industry that can create a kind of a negative halo around your whole sector?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, to date, SPECT, we've been very cautious. To Chris's point, we're still using this human in the loop concept. So none of our decisions are fully AI driven. There's always a human, a board certified doctor behind all of the decisions that we make. And that's because we're trying to be cautious, right? And we're trying to understand where are the limits of our algorithms. We use it as a tool to help, simplify workflow, to help doctors be more productive, but at the end of the day, the doctors still have the final say on the decision that comes out of it.
Okay, great. Alpin, let me ask you on Michael's point. We're getting a bit philosophical, but I think there's an angle of this is heavily philosophical. At what point, is there a risk of using humans? Because humans are also the basis of a lot of bias. So when do you know to let the machine, and you see it in healthcare, where at some point the ability to analyze clinical trials and research and unique background of somebody to diagnose that the machine may do things better than the human at some point in the future. But can you kind of give us your general view about the role of humans in AI, and when do you want to do it, and when at some point you say this is actually going to create more problem than good?
And I think it's a great question. I don't have all the answers. But on the other hand, I think human in the loop is the first of the steps, right? So I'll give you an example. There was a paper published in Nature in 2020, in January 2020, talking about mammography and machine working with the radiologist for mammography. So in the U.S. population, when the machine worked with the radiologist, it was able to reduce the false positive rates by 5.2% and false negative rates by 9+%. So if that happens, machine and humans are working together because you have second pair of eyes, right? One is not overriding the other necessarily, but one is informing the other. So in that way, the collaboration works much better than the machine alone. We're not at a point right now where we can let machine go on its own. We may get to that some point, but right now, I think human-machine collaboration is probably the best way of doing that, especially in medicine where it's a high-stakes game.
Okay. Excellent. And again, on this, Alpin, any examples at Geisinger itself on what you're doing to kind of self-police, self-regulate to ensure good outcomes? And where do you need broader standards or regulation to ensure the whole sector doesn't get damaged by one or two bad actors?
Yeah, so I co-chair a committee, what we call AI Steering Committee, where we have folks from from operations to finance. Many of the folks in the C-suite are on that committee, so that we talk about these issues upfront. How do we make sure that the things that we are developing, that we're talking about ethics as well as biases upfront? So that's one part of it. But I think having that as part of your culture is going to be the ultimate solution to many of these issues.
Excellent. Very, very helpful. So let me take another question here that's from the audience so we can kind of intersperse them. There's a variety of questions about the data privacy rules in the US, the protection of patient data. And interestingly, the questions are saying, actually, is this kind of not been developed appropriately, that the limitations on data and how much is getting anonymized is actually creating limitations about understanding the problem, target segments, et cetera, et cetera. How do you kind of look at the data privacy rules here? Chris, you want to start with that?
You know, when it comes to like the specifics on data privacy, and it sounds like the question is addressed at, is there a point where the data privacy legislation that we're going into, is there a point where it gets so onerous that you can't develop models and standards overall? So when it comes to how you're commingling data from multiple healthcare systems and regulations around that, without knowing where that legislation is going, I haven't seen like just in the work that we focus on. I haven't seen like those kinds of regulations have an impact from a patient data perspective. I am seeing where, like, if you're looking at the types of data sets that you can analyze that are more behaviorally oriented, such as how people respond to emails and et cetera. Like if you're looking at those kinds of standards, a lot of the industry is preventing that level of analysis from happening, which I mean, I can understand in terms of how people want their data to be used. But unfortunately, I can't go extremely deep just because I haven't run into any roadblocks that are based on these types of elements. But if you would allow me, I would like to address a little bit of the question on self-regulation.
Sure.
Okay. Really quickly, one thing I wanted to throw out is that, especially with tech companies, if we have a scenario where we're relying on organizations to completely police internally, but then you had that scenario I talked about where the model that Epic was using didn't meet UCSF standards, then there's still like the gap that I see with self-policing is that there should be this is still technically self-policing, but if you're engaging a third party that's disinterested from the outcome, and that has expertise in the type and class of algorithm that you are working with, then that could, like for those organizations that might be stuck on these issues, like it takes a level of introspection to say, hey, we're stuck. We don't understand this concept of fairness, or we'd like somebody else to help. I think that it's really important to engage third parties in this issue. So I wanted to put that point out there, but to get us back on the data privacy aspect, it's not something that has become a roadblock for the types of algorithms we're working with just yet.
So far, okay, good, makes sense. Okay, let me go to you again just to get another triangulation on the data privacy issues. So, sharing information between providers, which apparently is fairly restricted today. If you have one provider that's got access to a much more diverse set of data points and users, et cetera, and another one doesn't, yet information can't be shared, is that creating a problem? And again, we need to look at modifying data privacy rules, or is that playing with fire here?
I mean, I would say there's definitely some needs for change. And I think Michael sort of alluded to this, that a lot of the time regulatory is lagging behind where we sort of are in our process of trying to get better at doing things. And I think I think you may be touching on somewhat of another related issue, which is interoperability. I mean, it's not even just about one provider having access to a greater, more diverse population set. I think we're having intense setbacks by just not being able to know all of the things that we should know about one individual person. And I don't think that we are where we need to be as far as from a regulatory perspective to truly get over that hump yet. I mean, and then we also have to say that there's only so much that regulation can do. I mean, there's some things that have been put into place. I think there was an interoperability mandate that's supposed to help push us towards, having a more clear picture of who each individual patient is. But yes, there's always going to be concerns, and it is the responsibility of the people who are using and sort of interacting with this data to make sure that it's protected and that it's being used for the right purposes. Yep. And then also leveraging de-identification of data when necessary in order to help protect the people that we're supposed to be helping.
Perfect. Let me ask one last question, then I'm going to do a broad question to everybody in closing here. Michael, let me go to you. Any kind of negative, unintended consequences of a lot of these practices in the U.S., innovation in the U.S., and I'm thinking of as an example, having lived abroad, that, we in the U.S. tend to be fairly U.S.-centric. And we kind of think that it's the target market. And I think, Chris, you were bringing up this example actually even within the U.S., but are there issues about how we're thinking about the end market that are even global in nature, that we need to be thinking about markets that aren't just in the US, that is a potential risk here?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, a lot of companies are focused on innovating in the US and us as well, and we're guilty of this, but the US population and the US problems do not represent the global problems. And we've even seen this, I think, 2018, Google was working on a retina algorithm, for diabetic retinopathy, and they had very good results here in the US. But then when they tried to deploy it out in Thailand, they had terrible results. It was lower than 50%. And a lot of that came from because they did not understand, the problems and the conditions that were there, right? You can optimize things for here in the US where we have good infrastructure and good internet and good electricity, reliable, infrastructure. But when you go to third world countries, all of these things go out the window and different problems will arise. Mm-hmm. And so absolutely, there needs to be some conscious decision and understanding. I think this is what Chris was alluding to, is understanding what the target population is, what the target population problems are, and really adapting your solution to fit that mold.
Perfect. Let me ask a final question of all of you, and then I'll do a wrap up with some of my takeaways. And it basically is to fast forward 5 or 10 years from now and say, what does the ideal environment look like where we strike the right balance between the benefits of data and AI that should manifest itself in better healthcare in a variety of ways against the negative externalities, all of the issues that we've talked about that keep inclusion from happening in these solutions. What is the picture? How do things work? What are the roles of the actors in all of this, et cetera? Alpin, how about we start with you?
In 5 to 10 years, what I would like to see, I think EMR was a first step in the right direction, the collection of data and the collection of digital data, but it's not all discrete. We don't always have access to it to make for the machines to actually make decisions on it. So discretization of the data would be one of them, and then the second would be a second layer of insights that we can provide using models. So that we can take better care of patients. There is no doubt in my mind that there's data overload. When a clinician looks at the data, there is significant data that are presented to them, and there is data overload. And because there's data overload, there's data waste. So along with, so I think what I would like to see in about 5 to 10 years is take the next step from EMR to more intelligent EMR, where they provide insights for better patient care.
Perfect. Very, very helpful. Chris, your thoughts?
Sure. And how about I piggyback off Malcolm? I thought that was a great answer. And a lot of the things that need to happen for that intelligence are some of the plumbing issues that Ojeki brought up with regards to interoperability and being able to have systems that can develop full perspectives on patients and their scenarios. It would be really exciting to have that, to have clinicians be able to operate with that full perspective and full backing. Because if they look at the insights that are being generated by these systems and don't trust them, or if they look at those insights and are aware of these types of biases and things like that, then the insights won't get used. So it would be really exciting to see that, to see if we can get a more full, base these insights on a more full perspective. I'm going to add one more thing, which is kind of the reason why I'm excited about this conference and like these types of conversations is people who are in these leadership positions who are making decisions about the systems that are being used. It would be a really good outcome in the next 5 to 10 years, no matter what the underlying technology is, for data ethics, for responsible AI to be a big priority for when they're evaluating these systems and deciding when to spend these major contracts. Because if that then becomes a major decision making criteria for them, then it can potentially force the issue for vendors and those who are developing these technologies. So I would love to see more education on that leadership front. Not necessarily that they have to know how to get in and develop algorithms specifically, but that they're aware of these things and have some good standards and practices, good playbooks to make ethical decisions regarding AI.
Excellent. Excellent. Ojeki, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would love to see us fill some of the holes in what we know about every individual patient, but sort of in two ways. One, the issue of, if I go to see a provider in a certain health system, I want him to or her to know more about me than what I've done within his or her health system, one. But then I also would love for our healthcare system to be able to economically support me interacting with my healthcare system on a more frequent basis. If I have hypertension, I shouldn't only be coming to get seen once every 6 months or once every 3 months. That's not a clear picture. That's not based off of disease progression. Mm-hmm. And right now it's not really possible because of the restrictions we have. First of all, it's expensive, and there's not enough time or there's not enough workforce. So I would love for us to sort of have a clear picture for both of those perspectives.
Perfect. Very interesting. Michael?
Yeah, maybe I'll conclude and draw an analogy back to the self-driving technology. I think today we're in this stage where it's a race to capture the data. But now we've seen over the last few years, with Lyft, Uber, Google, they're making their data sources open source. And so I think that's a little bit of what we've been discussing earlier of having this interoperability. And I think over the next 3 to 5 years, I would love to see the medical community also open source their data to have this interoperability, to be able to reconcile databases and have that full picture and understanding. A lot of this will come from collaboration, and unification, and all of this starts from conversations. And this is exactly what we're doing today, right? Having these conversations. But I think the conversations need to come, from everywhere, whether it's the providers, the industry, the regulators, and most importantly, the patients, right? They need to have a say in this also on how we use their data and how that data is going to be used to treat them and make informed decisions about them.
Excellent. Let me do this in the last minute or two. I always like to share my kind of my takeaways. And I've just found all of your comments really, really interesting. The first takeaway I got is the prize or the opportunity is fairly large here if you manage the use of data and AI well, in the form of quality, in the form of cost, in the form of access, and access, to Ogeki's point, access isn't just can somebody come in and see you, but how often they can see you, under what terms they can see you, et cetera. But the prize here is fairly large. In a system where healthcare costs are pretty costly, not everyone's got access today, et cetera. The second main point, though, is there are significant number of risks here. And in its worst form, playing with fire. And playing with fire can be bad data sets. It can be an organization that isn't attuned, aware, and skilled to go deal with these issues. A lack of ability to kind of understand data, have access to data, et cetera. There's a bunch of risks here that can generate unintended consequences. What are some of the solutions? And, I found this very interesting. The solutions were heavily, we own this oriented inside an organization. That doesn't say there isn't coordination and other things, but a lot of it is, number one, what is the culture of the organization? Is the organization having conversations about, number one, what they're trying to achieve? What is happening actually with outcomes of products? Is it really as you intended in terms of target markets, outcomes, et cetera? Is there a self-correcting kind of mechanism or not that is going on inside an organization? But all of this is kind of oriented around being clear about what you're trying to achieve, course correcting where you need to, collaborating with others. All those things are essential. The solutions here, and this is a little bit of my takeaway, being more in tech, is some of the solutions are a little bit orthogonal to kind of sometimes the normal DNA of a young tech company, which is to iterate, throw something out, see what happens, et cetera. And what you're saying is, yeah, the agility is all cool and that's great, but remember, left to its own devices, you can end up with some really bad outcomes. And so you've got to be thoughtful about what you're kind of turning out as an innovator. A couple of the thoughts about where the solutions are, the type of people that you hire. So Ogeki's point about, are you hiring people that are aware of a broad audience? And I think Ogeki's, I'm putting words in her mouth, but the ultimate kind of vision here is everybody should be aware of all markets. Everybody has an onus, not just kind of hiring somebody to think about this market and hire somebody to think about that market, but we should have that as a cultural element of what we do. And then a couple other takeaways is, again, with this thought about we mostly own this ourselves, there's a role for regulation. There's a role for collaboration on setting common standards, that still is out there, but don't punt on things. Don't kind of foist things over to some third party, assuming something's going to get solved and assume it's going to get done. Because to Michael's point earlier, regulators, there aren't enough of them and they can't get trained quick enough on all this, that we're going to have to be responsible. Final takeaway I had, and Chris, I hope I don't put words in your mouth, but if we manage discussions well, if we continue to have conversations like this in an environment where there's greater adoption and availability of data, which is going to naturally create more problems because things are getting penetrated in a market faster. But if we're having the discussions about where the risks, the opportunities are, how you design, where best practices, that we can manage all this, that we can get the best of while mitigating a whole bunch of bad stuff. This isn't a sinking ship. This isn't something that we've made massive errors on that we need to stop or do a 90-degree course shift. We can kind of manage the best of this, and it's up to us to be responsible about all this. Did I miss anything major? Did anybody say, Kramer, you got this completely wrong. You were asleep with a switch on this?
One thing I'll add is that I don't think AI is a choice in medicine. I think it's a must. We're going to have to figure out how to use it responsibly to take better care of our patients. And that's for me, that's a takeaway.
Well said. A good imperative. Let me just say a big thank you to each of you. I learned a huge amount from you, and you brought your own experience that kind of took the general idea down to kind of practical. How does this stuff actually work? Thank you very much for your partnership with UCLA. I want to thank the student organizers who did a terrific job, and I want to thank the audience for a lot of great questions. Thank you guys all very much, and stay well.